The bread tasted like ash in Sheriff William Hastings's mouth. It was March 14th, 1838, just past noon on a Tuesday that had started like any other in Natchez, Mississippi. Hastings sat alone in his office, enjoying the lunch his wife Mary had packed that morning: thick slices of bread, a wedge of sharp cheese, and an apple from their small orchard. His deputy, Samuel Brooks, had ridden out an hour earlier to settle a boundary dispute between two farmers on the eastern edge of Adams County. The office was quiet, peaceful, the kind of silence that Hastings had learned to appreciate after 18 years of wearing the sheriff's badge. Then the door opened. No knock, no announcement, just the slow, deliberate creak of hinges that needed oiling, and suddenly she was there. Hastings looked up, his hand freezing halfway to his mouth, the bread forgotten. The woman standing in his doorway was thin, unnaturally so, as if she'd been carved from pale wax and left too long near a flame. Her skin had the translucent quality of someone who spent their days hidden from the sun, stretched tight over sharp cheekbones and a jaw that seemed too prominent for her narrow face. She wore a plain dress of dove-gray cotton, clean but worn at the cuffs and hem, the kind of simple garment a house servant might wear on her rare day of rest. Her dark hair was pulled back from her face with severe precision, scraped into a tight bun at the nape of her neck. Not a single strand dared to escape. Her posture was perfectly straight, almost military in its rigidity, and she moved with an odd gliding quality, as if her feet didn't quite make contact with the wooden floor. But it was her eyes that Hastings set down his food and slowly pushed back his chair. They were completely, utterly empty. Not sad, not frightened, not angry, just empty, like two dark wells that went down and down forever, reaching towards some bottomless place where light couldn't penetrate. Looking into those eyes was like staring into an abyss that had somehow learned to stare back. Hastings had seen many things in his years as sheriff. He dealt with drunks who'd murdered their friends over card games, thieves who'd killed for pocket change, and one particularly disturbed man who'd set fire to his own home with his family inside. He'd witnessed 4 hangings and investigated more deaths than he cared to count. He considered himself a man not easily unsettled. But something about this woman, about the absolute emptiness in her eyes, and the way she stood there watching him with the patience of something that had all the time in the world, made his skin crawl. "Ma'am," he said, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended. His right hand moved instinctively toward the desk drawer where he kept his pistol. "Can I help you with something?" The woman tilted her head slightly, like a bird examining an insect. When she spoke, her voice was flat and emotionless, as mechanical as a clerk reading from a ledger. "I need to confess." Waited, his hand now resting on the drawer pull. "Confess to what, ma'am?" "Murder." The word dropped into the quiet office like a stone into still water. "I've murdered 7 people." For a moment he's certain he'd misheard her. 7 people? In Adams County? There hadn't been 7 murders in the past 5 years combined, and he would certainly know if 7 people had been killed. He would be investigating the deaths right now, not eating lunch at his desk. He studied her face, looking for signs of intoxication or madness, but her eyes remained clear, empty, yes, but focused. She wasn't slurring her words or swaying on her feet. She simply stood there, perfectly still, waiting for his response with the patience of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. "Ma'am," he said carefully, pulling his hand away from the gun and instead reaching for the notebook he used to record witness statements. "Let's start with your name." "Miriam Blackwell." He wrote it down, noting the steady, unchanging tone of her voice. "And where do you reside, Miss Blackwell?" "I worked at Wellington Manor until 2 days ago." Wellington Manor? The name sent a small jolt through Hastings. The Wellington family was one of the wealthiest and most prominent families in the county. Charles Wellington owned 300 acres of prime cotton land overlooking the Mississippi. The family was respected, influential, deeply embedded in Natchez society. "You worked there as—" Household staff. Cooking, cleaning, whatever was required. And you said you were dismissed 2 days ago? Yes. Why were you dismissed? For the first time, something that might have been amusement flickered across her face. There and gone so quickly Hastings almost missed it. They said I stole from them. Money and jewelry, they claimed. She paused. I didn't. But they dismissed you anyway. Yes. Hastings made a note. False accusations of theft were sometimes used to dismiss servants without giving the real reason, though I couldn't imagine what that reason might be in this case. Miss Blackwell, you said you murdered 7 people. Who were these people? She turned her head then, those empty eyes finally focusing on his face with an intensity that made him want to look away. The Wellington family, she said. All of them. The pen actually slipped from Hastings' fingers, leaving an ink blot on the page. The entire Wellington family? Yes. Charles Wellington, aged 48, his wife, Victoria Wellington, aged 45, their eldest son, Edward Wellington, 29 years old and recently married, their second son, Robert Wellington, 27 years old, their daughter, Margaret Wellington, 24 years of age, the youngest child, Daniel Wellington, only 7 years old, and Edward's wife, Carolyn Wellington, 26 years old, married into the family just 2 years ago. Hastings felt his heart hammering against his ribs. She had just named 7 members of one of the most prominent families in Mississippi, reciting their names and ages as if she were reading from a parish register. Miss Blackwell, he said slowly, pulling his hand away from the gun and instead reaching for the notebook he used to record witness statements. Are you telling me that you killed the entire Wellington family? Yes. When did this happen? The final deaths occurred on March 11th, 3 days ago. 3 days? Hastings would have heard about it. The death of one Wellington would have sent shockwaves through Natchez society. The death of the entire family would have brought the whole county to a standstill. How did you kill them? Poison. She said it the way someone might say Tuesday or bread, a simple statement of fact requiring no emotion. Poison. Several kinds. And then she began to speak, and she didn't stop for the next 2 hours.
Miriam Blackwell described everything. She knew the family's daily routines down to the minute. She knew that Charles took his coffee at precisely 7 o'clock each morning, 2 sugars and a splash of cream, always from the same china cup. She knew that Victoria suffered from headaches and drank a special herbal tea before bed, chamomile with honey and a touch of lavender. She knew that Edward worked late in his father's study most evenings, often snacking on whatever remained from dinner. She knew that young Daniel had a sweet tooth and would sneak into the kitchen for cookies when he thought no one was watching. She knew their habits, their preferences, their schedules, their vulnerabilities, and she had used all of it against them. I started in April of 1837, she said, her voice maintaining that same flat, mechanical quality. Small amounts at first. Pokeweed root, dried and ground into a powder so fine it dissolved invisibly into liquids. Just enough to cause mild stomach upset, nothing that would raise suspicion, just enough to begin the process. What process? Hastings heard himself ask, his hand cramping as he struggled to keep up with her words. Building tolerance while building toxicity, she said, as if explaining a cooking recipe. The human body is remarkably adaptive, Sheriff. If you introduce a poison slowly enough, the body learns to tolerate increasing amounts. The symptoms actually decrease even as the dosage increases. The victims think they're getting better when they're actually getting worse. The poison becomes part of them, woven into their blood and bones and organs. She described obtaining the substances she needed. Certain plants grew wild in the woods around Natchez, white snake root, water hemlock, oleander. Others could be purchased from any apothecary if you knew what to ask for and didn't draw suspicion. Autumn crocus seeds, dried foxglove leaves, and yes, occasionally small amounts of arsenic from the rat poison kept in the manor's cellar. But arsenic is obvious, she said, with that hint of something that might have been professional pride. The most incompetent physician will detect arsenic if you use too much of it. The plant-based poisons are better.
They mimic natural illnesses, digestive troubles, fevers, inflammation of the organs, nothing that seems deliberately caused. Hastings felt sick as he listened. The level of knowledge this woman possessed, the meticulous planning, the cold calculation. This wasn't the ramblings of a madwoman. This was the testimony of someone who had studied her craft with the dedication of a scholar and executed it with the precision of a surgeon. "Why?" Hastings finally interrupted, his voice hoarse. "Why would you do this? What did the Wellingtons do to you?" Something changed in her face. Not quite emotion, she seemed incapable of that, but a subtle shift, a shadow passing behind those empty eyes. "They did something unforgivable," she said quietly, "and so have I." She continued before he could press further, describing the pattern of illnesses that had plagued the Wellington family throughout 1837 and into early 1838. How each family member had fallen sick multiple times, recovered, then fallen sick again. How the episodes had become more frequent as time went on. How Dr. Benjamin Cross, the family's physician, had been completely baffled by the recurring symptoms. "He tested everything," Miriam said, and now there definitely was amusement in her voice, dark and bitter. "He tested the water supply, the food stores, the air quality in the rooms. He never once taught to test me. I was invisible to him, just another servant, part of the furniture." Then she described the final dinner. March 10th, 1838, a Sunday evening. The whole family gathered, as they did every Sunday, for their traditional meal together. I prepared roasted chicken with herb gravy, potatoes whipped with butter and cream, fresh vegetables from the garden, and for dessert, a peach cobbler that young Daniel had specifically requested. Her voice dropped slightly, and for the first time Hastings heard something that might have been regret. "Daniel asked me 3 times that week when I would make the cobbler. He loved peach cobbler. He would eat it until he made himself sick if his mother didn't stop him." "You poisoned a 7-year-old child," Hastings said, unable to keep the horror from his voice. "I poisoned everyone who bore the Wellington name," Miriam corrected. "Daniel was a Wellington. What was done to my sister affected him the same as the others, even if he was too young to have participated. The poison doesn't discriminate based on age." She went on, describing how she'd put the final concentrated dose into the gravy, a mixture of everything she'd been building in their systems for 11 months, enough to finish what she'd started. They ate together in the dining room, the whole family, gathered around that long mahogany table with the crystal chandelier casting light like diamonds across their faces. They complimented the meal. Charles asked for seconds of the gravy. Daniel ate 3 servings of the cobbler. She watched from the doorway, she said, watched them eat the poison she'd prepared, watched them retire to the sitting room afterwards, reading and talking, the perfect portrait of a contented family. They felt tired that evening, perhaps a bit unwell, but nothing alarming. They'd felt unwell so many times before, and it had always passed. So they went to bed at their usual times. She paused, and Hastings found himself holding his breath. And by morning, she continued, they were all dead. The silence in the office was absolute. "I found them on Monday, March 11th, she said. Charles in his study, slumped over his desk where he'd apparently tried to work despite feeling ill. Victoria in their bedroom, one hand reaching toward the bell pull she tried to ring for help. Edward on the floor of his room, halfway to the door. Robert in his bed, curled on his side. Margaret at her vanity, her head resting on her folded arms. Carolyn in the nursery, she'd gone to check on Daniel during the night. And Daniel himself, in his small bed, looking like he was simply sleeping." Hastings realized his hands were shaking. He gripped the pen tighter, trying to steady himself. "What did you do then?" "I spent 2 days with them," Miriam said, and for the first time real emotion entered her voice, something raw and painful and almost human. "I washed their bodies. I dressed them in their finest clothes. I folded their hands across their chests and closed their eyes. I sat with each one and told them why I had done it. Even though they couldn't hear me anymore, I told them." "Told them what?" "The truth."
Her empty eyes met his. About what they had done, about what I had taken from them in return, about justice and revenge and whether there's any real difference between the two. She described cleaning the house methodically afterwards, disposing of the poison bottles, washing every surface that might hold residue, eliminating any trace of her crime with the same meticulous attention to detail she'd used in the poisoning itself. "And then I came here," she finished, "because I wanted someone to know. I wanted it recorded. I wanted a witness to what I had done and why, even if no one can prove it." Sheriff William Hastings sat in his office long after the sun had set, staring at pages and pages of confession he'd written. Outside, the streets of Natchez grew quiet as businesses closed and families settled in for the night. The Wellington family was alive, all 7 of them. He'd confirmed it himself. But somewhere in his gut, in that place where instinct lived, Hastings knew he'd just documented something terrible. Not a crime that had already happened, but a crime that was still unfolding, slow and invisible and impossible to prove. A murder that would take decades to complete. And as he locked Miriam Blackwell's confession in his desk drawer that afternoon, one question burned in his mind. What kind of killer confesses to murders that haven't finished yet?
Sheriff William Hastings didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed beside his wife Mary, listening to her gentle breathing in the darkness, while his mind replayed every word of Miriam Blackwell's confession. The meticulous details, the cold precision, the absolute certainty in her voice when she described deaths that hadn't happened yet. "I killed them. The dying just hasn't finished yet." Those words echoed in his head like a funeral bell. When dawn finally broke on March 15th, Hastings was already dressed and sitting at his kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Mary found him there, staring at nothing, his face drawn and tired. "William?" She touched his shoulder gently. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," he muttered. Then, seeing the worry in her eyes, he forced a smile. "Just a difficult case, nothing for you to concern yourself with." But it was everything to concern himself with, because despite Deputy Brooks's confirmation that the Wellingtons were alive and well, Hastings couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. A woman had walked into his office and confessed to 7 murders with such specific detail that he could see it happening as she spoke. And then the supposed victims turned out to be alive and well, going about their evening meal as if nothing had happened. It made no sense. Unless Miriam Blackwell was telling the truth, unless she really had poisoned them and the effects simply hadn't manifested yet, unless he was looking at a crime that existed in the future as much as the past. The thought was absurd, impossible, and yet. Hastings arrived at his office before sunrise and immediately pulled out the notes he'd taken during Miriam's confession. He read through them again, paying particular attention to her description of the Wellington family's pattern of illnesses over the past year. According to Miriam, every member of the family had suffered recurring bouts of sickness, stomach ailments, fevers, muscle weakness, episodes that would last several days, then mysteriously resolve, only to return weeks later, a pattern that had continued from April 1837 through March 1838. If that was true, there would be medical records. Dr. Benjamin Cross would have documentation. But first, Hastings needed to see the Wellingtons for himself. He needed to look them in the eye and understand why a woman who seemed entirely sane would confess to murdering them. Wellington Manor sat on 300 acres of prime cottonland on the eastern edge of Adams County, overlooking a bend in the Mississippi River where the water ran slow and dark. The main house was a testament to wealth and status, a Greek Revival mansion with tall white columns and wide verandas that wrapped around all 4 sides. Ancient oak trees lined the long drive, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that swayed in the morning breeze like gray curtains. Hastings had been to the estate several times over the years, always on social occasions. Charles Wellington served on the church board and the county council. His wife, Victoria, was known throughout Natchez for hosting elaborate dinner parties that drew guests from as far away as New Orleans. The family was, by all appearances, the very model of respectable Southern society, which made Miriam Blackwell's accusations all the more disturbing. Hastings rode his horse up the oak-lined drive just as the sun was cresting the horizon, painting the white columns of the house in shades of gold and pink. Smoke rose from the kitchen house, a separate building connected to the main house by a covered walkway, indicating that the morning meal was being prepared. Everything looked peaceful, normal, not at all like a house where 7 people had been slowly poisoned over the course of 11 months. He dismounted and approached the front door, his boots echoing on the wooden steps of the veranda. Before he could knock, the door swung open. Charles Wellington stood there, already dressed despite the early hour, holding a cup of coffee in one hand. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and commanding, with steel-gray hair and a face that spoke of authority and prosperity. But there were shadows under his eyes, and his hand, Hastings noticed, had a slight tremor as he raised the coffee cup to his lips. "Sheriff Hastings," Charles said, his voice carrying a note of irritation, "this is becoming a habit. First my deputy yesterday evening interrupting our supper, and now you at dawn. What exactly is this about?" Hastings removed his hat. "Mr. Wellington, I apologize for the early hour, but I need to speak with you and your family. All of them. It's a matter of some urgency." Charles's eyes narrowed. "This is about that woman, isn't it? The one who made those ridiculous accusations. You know about her confession? My deputy mentioned something about a deranged servant claiming she had murdered us all." Charles's laugh was harsh and humorless, quite obviously a fantasy, given that we're all standing here alive. "Nevertheless, I need to speak with your family." Charles looked like he wanted to refuse, but Hastings was within his rights as sheriff to question potential victims of a crime, even a crime that apparently hadn't succeeded. After a long moment, Charles stepped back from the door. "Very well, the family is gathering for breakfast. You might as well join us." The entry hall was grand, polished hardwood floors that gleamed in the morning light, a crystal chandelier hanging from a ceiling painted with elaborate frescoes, and a curved staircase leading to the upper floors. Through an open doorway, Hastings could see into the dining room where the family was indeed gathered around a long mahogany table. Victoria Wellington sat at one end, elegant in a morning dress of deep blue silk. She was a handsome woman in her mid-40s, with dark hair just beginning to show threads of silver and sharp, intelligent eyes that watched Hastings enter with obvious displeasure. The children, though Hastings had to remind himself that except for young Daniel, they hardly were children anymore, were arranged along the sides of the table. Edward, the eldest at 29, sat beside his wife Caroline. He was lean and scholarly-looking, with his father's strong jaw but his mother's dark eyes. Caroline was pretty in a delicate way, with blonde hair and pale skin that looked almost translucent in the morning light. Robert, the second son at 27, sat across from them. He resembled his father more than Edward did, broader, more physical, with an athlete's build, and a face that suggested he was more comfortable outdoors than in a library. Margaret, the only daughter at 24, sat next to her mother. She was beautiful, Hastings noted, with the kind of refined features that would have made her a prize in Natchez society. But there was something distant in her expression, something that reminded him uncomfortably of Miriam Blackwell's empty eyes. And at the far end of the table sat young Daniel, 7 years old, still wearing a napkin tucked into his collar, his face smudged with what looked like jam. All of them alive, all of them breathing, all of them staring at Hastings with expressions ranging from curiosity to annoyance. "Sheriff Hastings," Victoria said, her voice cool and controlled, "has something happened? Is there trouble in town?" Hastings turned his hat in his hands, suddenly aware of how insane this was going to sound. "Ma'am, gentlemen, Miss Wellington, I apologize for interrupting your breakfast, but I need to ask you all some questions about a former member of your household staff." "Former?" Charles raised an eyebrow as he took his seat at the head of the table. Which one? A woman named Miriam Blackwell. The change in the room was immediate and dramatic. It was as if someone had opened a window and let in a blast of cold air. Every member of the Wellington family went completely still. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. Forks stopped moving. Even young Daniel, who was squirming in his seat, froze. The expressions on their faces shifted through a series of emotions in rapid succession: surprise, recognition, and then something else, something that looked disturbingly like fear, or guilt, or perhaps both. Victoria was the first to speak, her voice tight and controlled. "That woman no longer works here. When did she leave your employment?" 2 days ago, Charles said, and his earlier irritation had been replaced with something harder, more guarded. What did she steal? Monet and Nuckenuptoby spent squell details that he could see it happening as she spoke. And then the supposed victims turned out to be alive and well, going about their evening meal as if nothing had happened. It made no sense. Unless Miriam Blackwell was telling the truth, unless she really had poisoned them and the effects simply hadn't manifested yet, unless he was looking at a crime that existed in the future as much as the past. The thought was absurd, impossible, and yet. Hastings arrived at his office before sunrise and immediately pulled out the notes he'd taken during Miriam's confession. He read through them again, paying particular attention to her description of the Wellington family's pattern of illnesses over the past year. According to Miriam, every member of the family had suffered recurring bouts of sickness, stomach ailments, fevers, muscle weakness, episodes that would last several days, then mysteriously resolve, only to return weeks later, a pattern that had continued from April 1837 through March 1838. If that was true, there would be medical records. Dr. Benjamin Cross would have documentation. But first, Hastings needed to see the Wellingtons for himself. He needed to look them in the eye and understand why a woman who seemed entirely sane would confess to murdering them. Wellington Manor sat on 300 acres of prime.
Back at his office, Hastings found Miriam Blackwell exactly where he had left her, sitting in the holding cell with perfect posture, hands folded in her lap, staring at the wall with those unsettling empty eyes. She didn't react when he approached, didn't turn to look at him, didn't acknowledge his presence in any way. She simply continued her eerie vigil, as if she could see something on that blank wall that he couldn't. "Miriam," Hastings said carefully, pulling up a chair outside the cell bars, "I went to Wellington Manor this morning." "I know," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "They're alive, all of them." "I know," she repeated. Hastings leaned forward, gripping the bars. "So you lied to me. You didn't kill them." For the first time since he'd returned, Miriam turned to look at him, her empty eyes fixed on his face with that same unsettling intensity he remembered from yesterday. "No, Sheriff," she said calmly, "I didn't lie. I told you exactly what I did. You just misunderstood what it meant." "Then explain it to me. Make me understand." Miriam tilted her head, studying him like a physician might study a particularly interesting specimen. "I poisoned them. I introduced toxins into their systems over the course of 11 months. I built up concentrations in their organs, their blood, their bones. I made the poison part of them, inseparable from their own flesh. That part is true. That part happened exactly as I described." "But they're not dead." "Not yet, Sheriff," Miriam agreed. "Death isn't always immediate, Sheriff. Sometimes it's slow. Sometimes it's planted like a seed and takes years, even decades to grow." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping. "I killed them. The dying just hasn't finished yet." Hastings felt a chill run down his spine, despite the warmth of the morning. "You're saying you poisoned them in a way that won't kill them for years?" "I'm saying I poisoned them in a way that has already killed them. They just don't know it yet.
Their bodies are carrying death inside them right now, accumulating in their tissues, altering their fundamental biology. Eventually, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, that damage will manifest, and when it does, they'll die, and it will be murder, even if no one else recognizes it as such. Hastings struggled to find the words. That's insane. You can't possibly know that will happen. Miriam's expression didn't change. Can't I, Sheriff? I've studied poisons for years. I know what each substance does to the human body. I know how they accumulate, how they integrate into tissues, how they cause damage that remains dormant for years before emerging. I didn't choose my substances randomly. Every dose was calculated. Every toxin was selected for specific long-term effects. She settled back against the wall of her cell. Charles Wellington has arsenic in his heart muscle right now. It's already there, already causing microscopic damage to the cardiac tissue. His heart will fail eventually, in his 60s probably. They'll call it natural causes, but it will be murder. Victoria has water hemlock compounds in her brain. They've crossed the blood-brain barrier and are already beginning to affect her neural chemistry. In a few years, she'll start experiencing paranoia, hallucinations. They'll call her mad, but it will be the poison. Edward has pokeweed toxins in his nervous system. The damage is accumulating even as we speak. He'll develop progressive paralysis. It will take years, but it's already inevitable. Stop, Hastings said, but Miriam continued, her voice relentless. Robert has cellular damage that will manifest as aggressive tumors. Margaret has lost neural pathways that regulate sensation and emotion. The damage is done, even if she doesn't feel it yet. Caroline's reproductive system has been damaged in ways that will prevent her from ever carrying a child to term. And Daniel, she paused, and for the first time something like emotion crossed her face. Daniel will live the longest, but the toxins in his blood will affect his children and his children's children. The Wellington line will wither and die over generations. Hastings stared at her, trying to comprehend what she was saying. Even if all of that were true, even if you somehow managed to poison them in this incredibly specific way, how would you know? How could you predict with such certainty what will happen years from now? Because I've seen it before, she said quietly. I've studied the literature. I've observed the effects of chronic low-level poisoning. I know what these substances do over time. And, she added, her eyes meeting his, because I tested it. Tested it? On whom? But Miriam had turned back to the wall, resuming her eerie staring. Ask the Wellingtons about Eliza, she said softly. Ask them what happened to her. Ask them how she died. Who is Eliza? Ask them, Miriam repeated, though I doubt they'll tell you the truth. People like the Wellingtons never do. They bury their crimes and move on, pretending to be respectable while the bodies rot beneath their foundations. What bodies? What crime? What happened? But Miriam was done talking. She sat there in her cell, perfectly still, staring at that blank wall with eyes that saw something he couldn't. And Hastings knew, with a certainty that settled in his gut like a stone, that there was more to this story, something dark and terrible that the Wellingtons were hiding, something that connected to Miriam's methodical revenge. He just had to find out what it was.
The rest of the day was spent trying to piece together Miriam Blackwell's background. Hastings sent telegrams to Louisiana, inquiring about the Beaumont family that Charles Wellington had mentioned as the source of Miriam's references. He checked records in Natchez and surrounding counties, looking for any documentation of Miriam's existence before she appeared at Wellington Manor. He found nothing. No birth records, no previous employment records, no family connections. The Beaumonts in Louisiana had never heard of anyone named Miriam Blackwell. There were no references, no letters of recommendation, no paper trail of any kind. It was as if she had simply materialized out of thin air on the doorstep of Wellington Manor in April of 1837. This should have been impossible.
In 1838 Mississippi, everyone had a history. Everyone came from somewhere, had connections to something. Even freed slaves had papers documenting their manumission. Even orphans had records from the institutions that raised them. But Miriam Blackwell appeared to have no past at all. Frustrated, Hastings decided to return to Wellington Manor early the next morning. He would speak with the household staff as he'd originally intended, despite Charles Wellington's obvious displeasure at the idea. If Miriam had worked there for nearly a year, someone must know something about her. But when he arrived at the estate at dawn on March 16th, he discovered that the household staff had been reduced. The butler who answered the door, an elderly black man named Samuel who Hastings had met on previous social visits, looked nervous and uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Sheriff," Samuel said quietly, "but several of the staff have been let go in the past 2 days. Mr. Wellington said they were no longer needed." "Who was let go?" "The kitchen staff, mostly. Lily, who worked with Miss Miriam, and Ruth, who helped with the cleaning, and James, who maintained the gardens. All dismissed yesterday morning." The same day Hastings had visited and asked to speak with the household staff. The timing was not coincidental. "Do you know where they went?" Samuel shook his head. "No, sir. They were given their wages and told to leave immediately. I haven't seen any of them since." Hastings felt anger rising in his chest. The Wellingtons were destroying evidence, silencing potential witnesses. They were actively working to make sure no one could corroborate or investigate Miriam's claims. "Samuel," Hastings said quietly, "did you know Miriam Blackwell?" The old butler's eyes flickered with something. Recognition, maybe, or perhaps fear. "I knew of her, sir. She worked in the kitchen and helped with serving meals, but I didn't know her well. She kept to herself mostly." "Did you notice anything strange about her? Anything unusual?" Samuel hesitated, glancing back over his shoulder as if afraid someone might overhear. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "She was always watching, sir. Always present, but somehow invisible at the same time, like a shadow that learned to move on its own. And her eyes," he trailed off, shuddering slightly. "Her eyes were like looking into empty wells. There was nothing behind them, nothing at all." "Did the family ever have problems with her before the alleged theft?" "No, sir. If anything, the mistress praised her work, said she was efficient and reliable. The family never complained about her service." "Then why dismiss her for theft so suddenly? Why not report it to the authorities?" Samuel looked deeply uncomfortable. "I don't know, sir. That's a question for Mr. Wellington." But Mr. Wellington was not available to answer questions. According to Samuel, the entire family had departed that morning for their property in New Orleans. They would be gone for at least 2 weeks, perhaps longer. Running away, Hastings thought, or at least putting distance between themselves and this investigation. "Samuel," Hastings said carefully, "have you ever heard the name Eliza?" The change in the butler's face was immediate and dramatic. Color drained from his dark skin. His eyes went wide. His hands, which had been steady until that moment, began to tremble. I don't know that name, sir." But his voice shook. "I think you do. Who was she?" "Please, Sheriff," Samuel whispered, genuine fear in his voice now. "I can't talk about this. If they knew, if Mr. Wellington found out I'd spoken about—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "About what? What happened?" But Samuel was already backing away, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, Sheriff. I can't help you. I have work to do. Please, you need to leave." The door closed in Hastings' face with a soft but final click. Hastings stood on the veranda of Wellington Manor, staring at the closed door and feeling the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on him. Something had happened here. Something involving a person named Eliza. Something so terrible that even mentioning the name caused visible fear in those who knew about it. And somehow Miriam Blackwell's methodical poisoning of the Wellington family was connected to it. He needed to find Lily, the kitchen worker who had been dismissed. She worked directly with Miriam. If anyone knew the truth, it would be her. But finding one dismissed servant in all of Mississippi was like looking for a single grain of sand on a riverbank. Unless she wanted to be found. The note was waiting for him when he returned to his office that afternoon. It was tucked under the door, folded and sealed with a spot of candle wax. No name on the outside, no indication of who had left it or when. Hastings picked it up carefully and broke the seal. Inside, in crude but legible handwriting, was a single sentence. "Sheriff, if you want to know about Eliza, meet me at the Old Oak by Fletcher's Creek at sunset. Come alone. L." Lily, presumably. Hastings looked at the note for a long time, weighing the risks. It could be a trap. It could be someone trying to lure him out to a remote location for reasons that had nothing to do with the Wellington case. But it was also his only lead. As the sun began to set that evening, Sheriff William Hastings rode out to Fletcher's Creek, a small tributary that fed into the Mississippi about 3 miles south of town. The old oak tree was a local landmark, a massive tree that had to be at least 200 years old, with branches that spread so wide they could shade a dozen people. He arrived just as the sun was touching the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. At first he thought the meeting place was empty. Then he saw her. A young black woman, maybe 20 years old, stepping out from behind the massive trunk of the oak tree. She was thin and wiry, with intelligent eyes that darted nervously around the clearing, checking to make sure Hastings had come alone. "Lily?" Hastings asked quietly, dismounting from his horse. "You're investigating Miss Miriam?" "I am. She confessed to poisoning the Wellington family." "I know," Lily said quietly but steadily, "and she probably did it too, though I didn't know what she was doing at the time. None of us did." "Tell me about her. What was she like?" Lily wrapped her arms around herself, despite the warmth of the evening. "She was wrong somehow, not in a way you could point to exactly, but in a way you could feel, like she wasn't quite human, like she was something else wearing human skin." It was almost exactly what Victoria Wellington had said and what Samuel, the butler, had implied. "She started working at the manor in April last year, showed up one day, and the mistress just hired her without asking the rest of us. That was unusual. Usually Mrs. Wellington consulted with the head housekeeper about new staff, but with Miss Miriam it was just she appeared, and suddenly she was part of the household." "Did she say where she came from?" "Never talked about herself, never talked about anything personal. She'd do her work, and she was good at it, I'll give her that. Efficient, precise, never made mistakes. But then she'd just disappear. You'd turn around and she'd be gone, quiet as a ghost. Then you'd turn back and she'd be standing right behind you, and you'd never have heard her coming." Lily shuddered at the memory. "Did she have any friends among the staff?" "No one wanted to be close to her," Lily said firmly. "There was something about her that made you want to keep your distance, like your body knew something your mind didn't, that she was dangerous, that getting too close would be a mistake." "But you worked with her in the kitchen." "I did. That's how I saw." Lily hesitated, biting her lip. "I saw her one night, late. I'd forgotten something and came back to the kitchen. She was in the herb pantry, mixing something in a bowl. When she saw me, she moved to block my view, like she didn't want me to see what she was doing." "Did you ask her about it?" "I did. She said it was medicine for the family, that Dr. Cross had asked her to prepare some herbal remedy. But the way she said it, and the way she looked at me," Lily's voice dropped to a whisper, "I didn't believe her. But I was too scared to press. I got what I needed and left." "When was this?" "August, maybe late August. The heat was terrible that month, and Master Robert was sick. The heat was making it worse." "August, 4 months after Miriam started working at the manor. According to her own confession, she would have been well into her poisoning campaign by then." "Lily," Hastings said gently, "in your note you said I should ask you about Eliza. Who was she?" The young woman's eyes filled with tears. "She was one of us, worked at the manor since she was a girl. She died last March, just before Miss Miriam showed up." "How did she die?" "She got sick." Lily's voice was thick with emotion. "Real sick. It lasted for weeks. She was in so much pain, Sheriff. I've never seen anyone suffer like that. Dr. Cross couldn't figure out what was wrong with her. She just wasted away." There was something Lily wasn't saying. Hastings could hear it in her voice, see it in the way her eyes wouldn't quite meet his. "Lily, what really happened to Eliza?" The young woman was silent for a long moment,
tears streaming down her face. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "She was only 17, Sheriff."
Sheriff William Hastings didn't return to his office that night. Instead, he rode straight home, dismounted in his yard, and sat on the porch steps until dawn, turning Lily's letter over and over in his hands without opening it. He already knew what it would say. The words Lily had spoken aloud under the oak tree were branded into his memory, but the letter, the physical documentation, represented something different. Evidence, truth, a record that couldn't be stolen or denied, unless it disappeared the way his other files might. As the sun rose on March 17th, Hastings made a decision. He wouldn't keep the letter at his office. He would keep it with him, always, in his inside jacket pocket, close to his heart, where no one could take it without him knowing. Then he went to see Dr. Benjamin Cross. The doctor's office smelled of carbolic acid and old books. Cross himself was a thin man in his mid-50s, with wire spectacles that constantly slid down his nose and ink stains on his fingers from hours of writing notes. He looked up from his desk when Hastings entered, surprise crossing his weathered face. "William, it's barely past dawn. Is someone hurt?" "No, Benjamin. I need to see your medical records for the Wellington family." Cross's expression shifted from surprise to wariness. "That's confidential medical information. You know I can't just—" "A woman has confessed to systematically poisoning them over the past year," Hastings interrupted. "I need to see if her timeline matches their symptoms." The color drained from the doctor's face. "Poisoning? But they're all healthy now, relatively speaking." "Tell me about relatively speaking." Cross hesitated, then pulled a leather-bound ledger from his shelf. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, flipping through pages covered in cramped handwriting. First call was May 3rd, 1837. Edward Wellington. Severe abdominal cramping, fever, muscle weakness. I treated him with laudanum and bed rest. He recovered after 3 days. Who was next? Victoria, 2 weeks later. Same symptoms. Cross ran his finger down the page. Then Robert in June, Charles in July, Margaret in August. They were all experiencing similar complaints: stomach pain, nausea, fever, weakness. The episodes would last 3 to 5 days, then resolve completely. How often did this happen? Cross's frown deepened as he scanned the entries. Initially, every few weeks, but by autumn it became more frequent. Sometimes multiple family members would be sick simultaneously. I was there at least twice a week through December. By January, it was nearly constant. I actually moved some of my supplies to their estate because I was spending so much time there. And you tested for environmental causes? Everything. The water supply, food stores, air quality. I was convinced there had to be contamination I wasn't detecting, but I found nothing. The symptoms suggested toxicity, but I couldn't identify the source. And then it stopped? Completely. Edward had an episode on March 12th, the last time I was called out. Since then, nothing. No one in the family has reported any symptoms. It's as if whatever was causing it simply vanished. March 12th, the day after Miriam claimed they had all died, the day she'd spent washing their bodies and telling their corpses why she'd killed them. Hastings pulled out the notes from Miriam's confession, the detailed list of substances she claimed to have used. "Benjamin, if someone had been administering these compounds in small doses over nearly a year, would it produce the symptoms you observed?" Cross studied the list, his face growing more troubled with each line. Pokeweed root, white snake root, oleander, water hemlock, autumn crocus, arsenic. He looked up at Hastings, his eyes wide behind his spectacles. Good God, yes, small, regular doses would produce exactly what I treated. The timing, duration, recovery periods, it all fits perfectly. And if someone had been building up the doses gradually, the body would adapt, Cross said slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. Tolerance would develop, masking the increasing toxicity. The symptoms might actually decrease even as the internal damage accumulated. Could that damage be permanent? Could it cause effects years later? Cross removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. "William, are you asking me if this woman actually succeeded in poisoning the Wellingtons? I'm asking if it's possible." The doctor was silent for a long moment, staring at the list. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Arsenic accumulates in bone and hair, long-term cardiovascular damage. The plant compounds, pokeweed, hemlock, oleander, they cause lasting nerve damage, organ dysfunction, cellular changes that might not manifest for years. Autumn crocus contains colchicine, which affects cell division at a fundamental level." He looked up at Hastings, his face grim. "Yes, it's possible. If someone carefully administered these compounds over an extended period, they could cause damage that won't become apparent until years later. The victims might feel perfectly healthy now while carrying the effects of chronic poisoning that will eventually kill them. How would we prove it?" "You can't." Cross's answer was flat and final. "Not without exhuming bodies and testing for accumulated toxins, and even then the evidence would be circumstantial. Some compounds break down over time. Some exist naturally in small environmental amounts. You'd never prove deliberate poisoning in a court of law." "So she gets away with it." "If she actually did it, yes, unless the pattern continues. If the Wellingtons begin dying or developing severe health problems over the next few years, and if those problems match the predicted effects of chronic exposure to these substances, that would be compelling evidence. Not legal proof, perhaps, but evidence." Hastings felt cold. "You're saying we have to wait for them to die to prove she killed them?" "I'm saying this is a crime, if it is a crime, that exists in the future as much as the past." Cross closed his ledger with a soft thud. "The murder hasn't finished yet."
Hastings left the doctor's office with a sick feeling in his stomach. He now had 3 pieces of evidence: Miriam's confession, Lily's testimony about Eliza, and Dr. Cross's medical records showing a pattern that matched Miriam's poisoning timeline perfectly. But when he returned to his office 2 hours later, he discovered that evidence had a way of disappearing. The lock on his desk drawer had been picked. Inside, the space where he'd stored his notes was empty. Everything was gone. Miriam's confession, 20 pages of meticulous testimony, his own observations and timeline, the copies he'd made of key witness statements, all of it had vanished. Nothing else in the office was touched. The cash box was still locked and full. The weapons cabinet was undisturbed. Even other files in the same drawer remained untouched. Someone had come specifically for the Miriam Blackwell case file. Hastings stood staring at the empty drawer, rage and frustration building in his chest. The Wellingtons. It had to be them. They had the resources, the motivation, and now, apparently, the desperation to commit burglary against the sheriff's office. He immediately went to Dr. Cross's office. The doctor looked up in alarm at Hastings' urgent entrance. "William, what's wrong?" "Your Wellington files. Check them, now." Cross's frown deepened, but he opened his filing cabinet. His hands moved through folders, his confusion growing. "That's odd. I could have sworn. Where did I put the Wellington records?" "They're gone, aren't they?" Cross looked up, his face pale. "How did you know?" "Because mine were stolen last night. Someone broke into my office and took everything related to Miriam Blackwell's confession." "But who would—" Cross stopped, realization dawning. The Wellingtons. "Can you reconstruct your records? Do you remember the dates, the specific symptoms?" Cross shook his head slowly. "Some of it, certainly, but the precise details, the exact timeline, without my notes, I can't be certain. And anything I try to recreate now would be dismissed as unreliable memory rather than contemporaneous documentation." Hastings swore under his breath. "They're burying it, erasing every trace that the poisoning might have occurred." "But why?" Cross asked. "If they're the victims, why would they want to hide the crime?" That was the question that haunted Hastings. The Wellingtons should want justice.
They should be demanding a full investigation, insisting Miriam be prosecuted. Instead, they were actively destroying evidence, which meant there was something about this case, something about Miriam's motivation, her reasons, that the Wellingtons desperately didn't want revealed. "Eliza," Hastings said quietly, "it's all connected to what happened to Eliza." And suddenly he understood. The Wellingtons weren't just covering up Miriam's poisoning, they were covering up their own crime, the abuse and murder of a 17-year-old girl whose death no law would ever prosecute. Miriam knew this would happen. That's why she'd confessed before the deaths occurred. She'd wanted a record to exist before the Wellingtons could erase it. She knew they would try to bury the truth. But she also knew that some truths, once spoken, can never be completely silenced. Hastings touched the letter in his inside pocket. Lily's testimony, the one piece of evidence the Wellingtons couldn't steal because they didn't know it existed. He would keep it safe. He would document everything, even if he had to write it all down from memory. Because someone needed to remember Eliza. Someone needed to remember what the Wellingtons had done and what Miriam Blackwell had done in return. Even if no court would ever care, even if no law would ever recognize it as justice, someone needed to remember. And Sheriff William Hastings decided that someone would be him.
3 days after the theft, a letter arrived. Not at Hastings' office, but at his home. Slipped under his door in the dark hours before dawn. When he found it, the wax seal was still warm. He opened it with trembling hands. "Sheriff Hastings, I'm writing this from a wagon heading north, but I wanted you to have the full truth before I'm too far gone to matter. What I told you under the oak tree was only part of the story. Here's the rest. Eliza wasn't just used by the Wellington men. She was 17, and they treated her like property they could break for sport. It went on for months. When she got pregnant, she didn't know which of the three was the father. Charles, Edward, or Robert. Maybe all of them were. She tried to tell Mrs. Wellington, begged for help. The mistress called her a liar, said she was trying to destroy the family's reputation. Said if Eliza spoke of it again, she'd be sold to the worst plantation in Louisiana. When they found out about the baby, Charles gave her something, called it medicine, said it would fix the problem and no one would ever know. But it wasn't medicine. It was poison. Eliza bled for 3 weeks. The pain was so terrible she couldn't even scream toward the end, just lay there shaking. Dr. Cross came, but they lied to him, told him she had some kind of fever. He never knew what they'd really given her. She died on March 3rd, 1837. They buried her the same day, before anyone could ask questions. Just a wooden marker in the plot behind the manor. Didn't even put her full name on it. After she died, some of us talked about going to the authorities. But who would believe slaves against the Wellingtons? What could we prove? Eliza was gone, buried, our word against theirs. Then Miriam came. April 1837, maybe 3 weeks after Eliza died. She never said she was the sister, but we knew. The same eyes, the same walk, the same quietness. She asked questions, careful, quiet questions. We told her everything. She stayed, took the job, and we thought maybe she just wanted to be close to where Eliza had been. We didn't know she was planning revenge, not until you came asking about poison. Then we understood. She'd been killing them slowly, the way they killed Eliza, making them carry death inside their bodies, the way they made Eliza carry it. I don't know if it was murder or justice, maybe both, maybe neither. All I know is Eliza deserved better than she got, and the Wellingtons deserved worse. Remember her, Sheriff. That's all I ask. Remember that Eliza lived and suffered and mattered. Lily. Hastings read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in his jacket pocket next to the first one. Now he had the full picture.
The Wellingtons had abused Eliza, gotten her pregnant, and killed her with poison disguised as medicine. They'd buried the evidence and moved on. And Miriam had come back to make them pay, not with quick death, but with the same slow poison they'd used on her sister. It was horrifying. It was also a kind of terrible symmetry.
The legal proceedings for Miriam Blackwell's commitment happened with disturbing speed. Within a week of her confession, she'd been examined by 3 physicians and declared mentally unfit. They testified about her delusional disorder, her fixed false beliefs about murders that never happened, her lack of appropriate emotional response, her potential danger to herself and others. No one mentioned that her confession might be true. No one brought up the Wellington family's pattern of illnesses or the suspicious timing of their recovery. The entire proceeding was designed to reach one conclusion. Miriam Blackwell was insane and needed to be locked away. Charles Wellington attended the hearing, sitting with Victoria in the back. When the judge signed the commitment papers, Hastings saw Charles lean over and whisper something to his wife. They both smiled, small, satisfied smiles. They had won. Miriam would disappear into the Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum in Jackson, where she would be forgotten. As the guards led her away in restraints, Hastings caught her eye. He tried to convey something, understanding, a promise to remember. Her empty eyes looked at him without recognition. But just before she reached the door, she spoke, so quietly only Hastings could hear. 23 years. That's when it starts. Remember the number, Sheriff. 23. Then she was gone. Hastings wrote the number in his journal that night. 23 years equals 1861. What begins then? The years passed like a slow-moving river. Hastings continued his work as sheriff, but he never stopped watching the Wellingtons, never stopped documenting what happened to them. At first, they thrived. The illnesses disappeared after Miriam's departure. They regained their health, their social prominence. They seemed untouchable. But Hastings noticed small things. Marcus's hands shaking, Victoria's increasing withdrawal from society, Edward's complaints of persistent fatigue. In 1842, 4 years after Miriam's confession, Edward's condition worsened dramatically. His hands trembled uncontrollably, muscle spasms, weakness that made walking difficult. Dr. Cross was baffled. "It's like his nervous system is failing," he told Hastings privately, "as if something is destroying the connections between his brain and muscles." By 1846, Edward was in a wheelchair. By 1848, he was bedridden, completely paralyzed except for his eyes. His mind remained sharp, trapped in a useless body. He died that year exactly as Miriam predicted. Progressive muscular degeneration, 10 years after her confession. Hastings wrote it all down. Margaret was next. After marrying in 1845, her letters home became strange. "I can't feel anything anymore. Not pain, not pleasure. I'm fading away." Her husband annulled the marriage, calling her unresponsive. She returned to Wellington Manor in 1847, a hollow shell. She died in 1851, failure to thrive, the doctors said. Her body had simply stopped living. Victoria's descent was dramatic. Paranoia began in 1849. She saw figures that weren't there, heard voices. She became convinced Hannah was watching her, judging her. "She talks to Eliza constantly," a servant told Hastings, "seems terrified of her." Victoria was committed to a sanitarium in 1852. She died there in 1854, still screaming about shadows and judgment. Robert developed tumors in 1853, aggressive cancer that spread with terrifying speed. He died within 6 months. Caroline suffered 4 miscarriages, each one more devastating than the last. She died in 1857 during her 5th pregnancy, bleeding out despite Dr. Cross's efforts. Charles lasted longest. Heart problems began in his 60s, irregular rhythms, chest pains. He died in 1868 of cardiac failure, slumped over his desk in the same study where Miriam said she'd found his body 30 years earlier. 6 Wellingtons dead, all matching Miriam's predictions with eerie precision. Only Daniel remained.
Daniel Wellington survived, but survival was a curse. He inherited the crumbling estate, struggled to maintain it through the Civil War and Reconstruction, but chronic illness plagued him. His children, 5 born, 3 dead in infancy, 2 in early childhood. The Wellington line withered, exactly as Miriam had predicted. Daniel aged prematurely, looking 70 at 50. His body carrying poison that passed to his children, generation by generation. He died in 1891 at 60, having outlived his entire family. The estate was sold, the grand house demolished, the Wellington name disappeared from Natchez society. Nothing remained except graves and Hastings' journal. Sheriff William Hastings retired in 1873, aged 75. He spent his final years documenting the Miriam Blackwell case in 3 leather-bound volumes. In 1875, he received word that the asylum in Jackson had burned, patient records destroyed. No trace of Miriam Turner remained. But an old orderly told him, "She escaped years ago. Walked out one night like she'd planned it from the start. Some say she's still out there, watching." One day, Hastings visited Eliza's grave and found it freshly tended, flowers planted, the stone cleaned, and tucked against the marker, a letter in familiar handwriting. "Sheriff Hastings, if you're reading this, you remembered. You kept the record. Thank you. Yes, I poisoned them. Every word was true. I made their deaths part of their bodies, inseparable from their flesh. I wanted someone to know before the Wellingtons could erase it. Why confess before they died? Because I knew they'd try to bury the truth, but I also knew you would remember. The asylum commitment was expected. I allowed it, needed to disappear while the process ran its course. The escape was simple. I've watched from a distance these decades, documenting everything just as you have, making sure each death matched my predictions, making sure the Wellingtons understood in their final moments what had been done to them and why. I visited each one before they died, told them about Eliza, reminded them of what they did, let them die with that knowledge. Do I regret it? I don't regret avenging my sister, but I destroyed 7 people, including a child. That weighs on me. It always will. But I would do it again, because some crimes are so terrible they demand terrible retribution, because the law failed Eliza utterly, and someone had to provide the justice it couldn't. You documented everything. You kept the record. That makes you part of this story, part of the testimony that Eliza's life mattered. Thank you for remembering when everyone else forgot. By the time you read this, I'll be gone, truly gone. I'm old and tired and ready to rest. I've done what I set out to do. Eliza has been avenged. The truth has been preserved. I hope that's enough. I hope she would think it was enough. Miriam Blackwell. Hastings read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face. Then he carefully placed it in his journal beside Lily's letters. He had his answer. Miriam had committed murder, slow, calculated 50-year murder. She had poisoned 7 people and never faced legal consequences. But she also delivered justice for a girl whose death would otherwise have been forgotten. Was it murder or justice? Hastings still didn't know. Maybe it was both. He wrote his final entry. This is the truth, all of it. What anyone does with this knowledge I leave to their conscience. Hannah existed. She suffered.
She died unjustly. Miriam existed. She remembered. She took revenge. The Wellingtons existed. They committed crimes. They paid eventually, though no court judged them guilty. These things happened. This is true. Whether it was right or wrong, I cannot say. Let history judge. I'm done. Sheriff William Hastings, 1875. He died in 1876. His daughter found the journals and donated them to the Mississippi Historical Society, where they sit today in an archive in Jackson.
The Wellington family is gone, their line extinct, their graves in Natchez visited by no one. But Eliza's grave remains. Her simple marker, Eliza, died April 3, 1837, beloved, still stands, maintained by the Historical Society. Most don't know the full story. They don't mention what happened to Eliza, or Miriam's decades-long revenge, or the 7 deaths connected by threads of toxin and retribution too subtle for any court to trace. But Sheriff Hastings's journals preserve it all. 3 volumes sitting in an archive, waiting for anyone curious enough to find the story buried there. The story of a woman who confessed to a crime that took 50 years to complete. Whether you believe it, whether you think Miriam actually poisoned them, or it was all elaborate coincidence, the records remain. The deaths happened. The timeline matches. The predictions came true. Was it poison in their blood or poison in their conscience? Was it murder or justice? The question remains unanswered, preserved in 3 volumes and empty graves, waiting. And perhaps that's exactly what Miriam intended, to leave a question that could never be fully answered, a confession both completely true and impossible to prove, a crime existing in the space between law and morality. The Wellingtons are dead, all of them, exactly as Miriam predicted. And that fact remains, documented and undeniable, waiting in an archive for anyone brave enough to confront what it might mean.